chairs empty up here in front if anybody else would like to sit. I'm going to grab this microphone. All right. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're lucky enough to have 4 people doing really interesting work. Let's see. Nick McCulloch here is a consultant at Slalom. He leads a data science team working on analytic strategies at enterprise scale. Then we've got Elizabeth Brennan, a developer on the R&D team at Regis, which stands for Regional Justice Information Services. She and her team evaluate emerging technologies for use in Regis's law enforcement data management systems. And then we have Mr. Paul Sorensen of the University of Missouri St. Louis. He leads the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance, whose mission is to build shared data infrastructure and support strong data actors in using quality data to improve people's lives. He's an associate director of UMSL's Community Innovation and Action Center, and previously founded and ran GoodMap, an online tool for nonprofits to organize information about the services they provide to their communities. Finally, we have Nehemiah Dakers, a volunteer with Code for America, who works with volunteer coders to write open source software to make government work more effectively. Currently works for the St. Louis City Recorder of Deeds, also experienced with geospatial software and cloud computing. So this seems like a great lineup to hear from a variety of different perspectives about data science work for public good. I think we would all enjoy it if, to begin with, each one of you would take a turn to just tell us a little bit about your work. Nick, I will start with you since you're sitting closest to me. Let's just make sure this microphone operation is working like we intend. It is. Yep. All right, very good.
So my name is Nick McCulloch, and I work for Slalom Consulting. We're a relatively large consulting firm here in St. Louis, and we work with various clients to solve all sorts of technology problems in general, and in the data science space as well. These are a relatively large team of data scientists, individuals who have a lot of cloud computing experience, and we have been growing relatively. Actually, we've been growing a lot in the St. Louis market, and one of the things that we spend a lot of time on is giving back to the community, and we've been working with various startups, specifically startups that want to apply machine learning and data science practices for social good. And I guess some good use cases and examples I would love to discuss tonight.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Brennan. I'm from the Regis Commission. Our office is right down the street, actually. Regis was founded in the 70s by a cooperation between the St. Louis City Police Department and St. Louis County, and we now have data sharing agreements for our data management software for almost 300 law enforcement agencies and 15,000 users in the St. Louis and Kansas City and Metro East area. So when you get pulled over, for example, and the police officer opens the laptop to run your driver's license or your license plate, it's first hitting Regis in most cases, and then it checks for local warrants and maybe like armed and dangerous kind of caution flags. And then it hits the State Highway Patrol database for that same information, and then it hits the federal databases. But we are like the local line of that. So Regis has like a ton of arrest records and missing person and wanted data. And so we are just at the beginning of our kind of data science machine learning journey. And so I run a team of 3, and we're looking at ways and developing ways to especially assist our investigators and our detectives who are finding Regis a really valuable resource for coming up with leads in their cases.
Cool. Hi, Hey everyone, I'm Paul Sorensen. I run the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance, and not to like spit out our mission again, but we really do two primary things. The first is to organize data people. We organize data people mostly in nonprofit, government, university, healthcare, the folks who are supposed to be doing all of this good on our collective behalf. And the second part of our work is building shared data infrastructure. So what are the tools, what are the processes, what are the things that people in governments and nonprofits in particular need to use data for good? And so in this space of working with people and building shared infrastructure, the Regional Data Alliance, which I'll refer to as the RDA because it's a little bit less of a mouthful, oftentimes serves as matchmaker. So we know that there are a lot of challenges in our governments, in our nonprofits, that need data, right, to solve effectively, to point to solutions, to understand how what we're doing. But the people with those data skills oftentimes do not speak nonprofit or do not speak government. And so we end up playing the role of translator to make sure that those projects can ultimately be successful. So plenty of things to talk about later, but I think that's good for now.
So, again, my name is Nehemiah Dacris of OpenSTL. So we're the local branch of Code for America, and Code for America is sort of a national effort to do a similar thing to what Data4good, sorry, not Data4good, what Good Maps does. And in fact, they're typically behind many of the regional data alliances across the country. But in our case, cart horse, it doesn't matter, right? Like, we don't just get efforts to collect data or organize it. We're normally focused on the effort of freeing it up, opening it up for the public use, actually creating applications so when our governments create these massive data products, massive databases, they should be put to public use. Otherwise, they're just giant files on basically spreadsheets and websites, and that's just sad, right? So these things can be used, and so that the data publishers are actually exercised and forced to produce decent and well-formed data. We make sure that the public is putting it to use. So we write software. In our case, we turn our local vacant housing database into a nice slippy map that anyone can use. And before we made an effort to create an API around the city's dockets and various dockets across the county to make our courts system more humane. All of the courts, all of them. So yeah, we've been working since 2012 in this city, and I was elected a few years ago. I can't take all the credit. It's a massive team, and we've got a couple of them in the audience, a few of them in the audience.
Cool. I'm really interested to hear how would you compare this sort of a public good kind of work in data science to other kinds of data science projects? Are there special challenges, or how does that compare to other kinds of things you've worked on? Who wants to jump in on special challenges? I bet you've all got a good answer for that. Elizabeth?
So some other projects I've worked on have involved mobile robotics and like sensor data. I made a thing that tells you when your washing machine is finished with its cycle one time because of the different vibrations that the washing machine makes at different cycle times. In those cases, I had a ton of control over the data and the sensors, and even if it was noisy, there were ways to reduce that noise. In the projects, for example, that we built a Apache Solar app to be a search engine for our arrest records, and just organizational noise, like, we have one database that is from before 1980, and we have another database of also relevant information that's after 1980, so combining data sources, cleaning up data, when you have a big user base, especially with text searching, you've got all kinds of lingo, and you end up having to really know your users to be able to make an application that actually works for them. And so just the noise of real data, real people, and real systems that have evolved over the years. I think working with legacy systems is a challenge.
Yeah, I'll echo those concerns and sort of point to an article I've been recommending to a lot of folks lately. I think it was written by the current executive director of Code for America, I forget what her name is, around AI deserts. And talking about how within governments and nonprofits, one of the biggest problems we have, and you just spoke to it, is the lack of sort of available, clean data that folks can use to understand what's going on in the community, right, within governments and nonprofits. And there are a lot of reasons for that. There are old legacy systems that don't talk to newer systems, some of which are still proprietary and a little hard of a nut to crack. You have a lot of this work that really isn't digitized at all, or isn't digitized effectively. And then you have the problem of fragmentation. We all live in St. Louis, so we know how difficult fragmentation is from a government standpoint. And I think it's even more so from a nonprofit standpoint. There is no requirement for nonprofits to share data other than 990 financial information, which has like one sentence typically on what the organization actually does. And so because of that, it's really hard for us to even understand who's out there and doing what, let alone sort of dive into the more complicated challenges of, okay, so what are the trends? You know, how can we do predictive analysis? How can we effectively build applications that give us meaningful information? So a lot of the projects that we've been involved in the past, right, like organizing nonprofit information, getting people access to it, oftentimes when people see the end product, they're a little disappointed. And the reason is because the data isn't there, right? Like we haven't really figured out a good way to work with, you know, the nun in the church basement who's handing out food that's an essential part of the safety net, and making sure that that can be connected to, you know, the food bank or, you know, data around food deserts, et cetera, to really begin to connect these dots. So I think the problem is deep. Right? If most data science challenges are about getting access to sort of clean, ready data, right? Those are the same challenges within governments and nonprofits, but I think the problem is much more deep and much more severe.
I'd say it's compounded by a lack of centrality to its purpose, right? You know, it's public data, so it means the user and its intended purpose is the public. Unfortunately, the public is an infinite quantity of causes, right? Like so it's like a fractal of problems, right? And so we have to take that challenge. I think one answer to that challenge is often just open sourcing the problem, right? Like, okay, we can decide for one solution, or at the very least one tool to solve a problem with this data. But that's just us. What about everybody else? One of our goals, one of the reasons why we as an organization mandate that our software is open source is so that our solution can be expanded upon by people, not us, you know, beyond our own imaginations. We have our own limitations, and that's just people, and I say we, that's a finite number no matter what. What about everybody else? And so that's why, like, that's why every time we have a hackathon, I say, okay, try to make something, you can make a tool, but like, afterward, like, keep working on it. You can create something that outlasts you. And I think the people of the Apache project predates Linux, so anyone who's used Apache anything, let alone Solar, that might be older than you are.
Just like everyone else would answer, you know, on the public side, it's been a little bit harder, you know, to aggregate the information. We've had to come up with creative scoring metrics to solve various problems. But when you put a lot of minds together tend to solve problems relatively well. So it just depends on how you approach it. That's what we found. But obviously, when you're dealing with machine-to-machine data, it's much easier. Unstructured text, it's really challenging and messy. So you aggregate multiple sources together, you're able to find good solutions.
That must be an aspect of the legacy systems that a couple of you touched on, that these databases must have been designed in an era when they couldn't have imagined what the things we'd be wanting to do with them now. Lots of fun. I wonder if each of you would talk a little bit about an example of a project that if you haven't done that already, one thing where you did a thing and it had some concrete impact, and maybe what were the circumstances surrounding how you came to this project? Does that make sense as a question? Okay. I'm curious about how these projects come together. How the actors find each other, how you frame the problem. Talk to us about that.
The contents of social good in general. Okay. We're working with a local startup nonprofit named Hugo, and we did a hackathon with them a little over 6 weeks ago. I think we had about 75 people participate with really good results. So Hugo, their mission statement is phenomenal. They're trying to find providers for social workers. So if there's a battered women's shelter or a mental health shelter, a social worker needs to find a specific facility with office hours that are open at a certain time, and they need to know the services. You'd be surprised how bad the data is in general. A lot of times it takes them a half an hour to find a specific provider for a problem, depending on how complex it is. Or homeless shelter is full for the night or for a couple of days. So they've been trying to aggregate this information using public sources, IRS data, using all sorts of different information, and they want to keep them really clean, and that's their business model. They're not trying to make money, but they do sell their information to government sources so they can keep their database updated. So they approached us, and we just thought this would be a great problem statement. If we could teach people that are interested in data science and machine learning, if we can come up with something that would be valuable and impactful for their ego. And that's where we did one of our hackathons, but I also have a couple junior data scientists working on problem statements on how to enrich their data, how to score it, how to apply machine learning, how to take multiple data sources, multiple APIs from Google, Yelp, Facebook, where providers might broadcast or put their information, like contact information, phone number, addresses, services that they provide, and then come up with various entity resolution and matching. You'd be surprised how many different facilities have slightly different names, and that becomes really tricky to match up. And you don't know how long it's been refreshed. But we put together a really cool problem statement where you pull data from multiple different sources. Sometimes you get a website that's returned that kicks off a web crawler and scraper, and from there you're able to pull information from websites using regular expressions. You can pull phone numbers and just use keyword searches to pull doctors' names or facilities, services that they provide, and you aggregate all that information. On top of that, we're actually taking Google images, if the images are new, and reading street signs and reading facility locations using combination of neural networks. So it's pretty cool. It's still a work in progress, but it's super impactful, and hopefully it will provide even more value to them and help
Is this
somebody.
a tool that is out there and helping people now, or is it still in development?
It's partially done, but it's still in development. It's beta version.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Pretty cool.
That's great. So one project that we have, it's kind of our biggest point of pride right now, is this free text search application. And it's for our arrest records. You know, we have a lot of different other systems, but the arrest system is a place where, like, the person who's running the booking station can put in a lot of information about people, and like the subject is being arrested, I should say. And there are all kinds of data fields on our subject entry form. So your first name, last name, race, sex, date of birth. But you can also fill out emergency contact information for the subject. You can fill out scars, marks, and tattoos. And what our users were telling us, I guess how we came up with this project, was we have user groups on a regular basis, and we have some detectives who are like investigation and I'm searching for somebody with a dragon tattoo, I'm not finding my records because it's in there and some clerk went to the trouble of putting that information in there, but they put it in the remarks field, not in the field that I'm searching for. And we didn't have a way to search the remarks field. And this is all on a legacy DB2 database structure. So we had to migrate our data and do like a live update process into our SQL server. And that was more for long-term planning. But then we sucked it all into this Apache Solr tool and enabled them to be able to be searching for these tattoo matches or other comments in the records field. It's taking the ability, I guess it's giving detectives the ability to find the information without penalizing the clerks for not putting it into the record correctly. And it makes it all more accessible. So we've had a lot of success stories from our detectives on, you know, I found this tattoo match from a shoplifter or a credit card skimmer. Our coolest one was when there was a unidentified body that went unidentified for a couple of days, and then they thought, oh, we should try Regis. And then they ran the search and they were able to identify this person because this subject had had prior encounters with law enforcement and their record was in the system. Another interesting side effect of this is that it incentivized our users to start filling out more information at the booking station because now it's usable. It's not going into this vault that it's never seeing the light of day again. And so we're getting like peer pressure, positive peer pressure within these organizations saying, hey, clean up your records, like make it useful because it's saving us time and it's helping close cases.
Nice.
Okay, so Mohit, Nehemiah, let me know if I'm getting the origin story of this wrong, because it starts with an OpenSDL hackathon. And so a couple of years ago, and I wasn't there, so this is all secondhand, the city came to OpenSDL with this problem of, hey, you know, we have this data about properties, we have this huge problem around vacancy, and we want you to, you know, figure out a way to use this data to solve or help us, you know, point to ways to solve the problem of all of this vacant land in the city of St. Louis. And some folks with OpenSDL and some volunteers, including John Leake, who some of you may know, who now works for the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance, sort of as a result of this project, sort of dug into the data and said, hey, we actually can't do much with the publicly available data that the city publishes about property and vacant property because it's a mess. You would have to look at one of 12 different files produced by 4 different departments to understand whether or not a parcel was vacant. And that's because it's not just city-owned vacant property from the LRA, but sometimes it's privately owned property and someone abandons it, and so the forestry division is now like cutting the huge amount of grass, and then so they label it as vacant, so you have to sort of chase down all of these data sources. And so John, while he was still working as a consultant at Doherty, worked with Laura Ginn, who works for the city of St. Louis, doing a lot of this this vacancy work on the ground, sort of identifying what should or shouldn't be demolished, to restructure those data into one sort of unified data set around vacancy. It took them months. It took a lot of subject matter expertise on behalf of the city to say this is what this field means and this is how it relates to this one and this other data set, and talking to a bunch of folks at the city. So that was cool, but we knew that over time, sitting down and pulling those 12 different data sets and doing that sort of transformation every time would get super annoying. And so one of the things, after John came to work for the Regional Data Alliance earlier this year, as our data architect said, is like, look, we want to solve this problem once and for all, but it's going to take a lot of hands on deck. And so the concept was that the city not only has information about vacant parcels, but it has information, all sorts of information about each address or each piece of property in the city that is in dozens of different data sets. And wouldn't it be great if we could pull that into one place? And without going too much into the detail, what was happening was that you're talking about legacy data systems, talking about a bunch of different city departments building their own data systems and collecting information that worked okay, I don't know if it worked well, for their day-to-day operations, right? So if you're a forestry division, you need to know whether or not the grass on something is high so you can assign someone to cut it or not, which didn't necessarily matter that much to the developer who was trying to figure out whether or not this vacant property was available. So we sort of, it's defining the problem of operations data, right? What do these departments or what does this organization need to do their day-to-day job versus using this data for analysis, right? Which is a lot of what, y'all do, we do collectively, and that's one of the big bridges to get beyond. So how do we tackle that problem? And so just sort of fast forwarding a bit, John said, look, we need people to help us essentially, either build or implement an ETL tool to help us pull down publicly available city data into one place, restructure it, and then sort of spit out this the first unified parcel data set the cities had, but we really haven't found a lot of this sort of information across the country. And to do so, over 6 weeks, just a couple of months ago, we worked with Doherty and developers at Doherty who were unassigned, who were on the bench, in 2-week sprints to sort of help us in the very time-consuming work of pulling down this data, remapping it into the sort of what we're calling the regional entity database, or REDB, because we want it to be more than just the city. And why I highlight that is it's a good example of a couple things. One, the fact that people will often in this sort of data for good space come to folks like you and say, hey, we have data, you can help us solve this problem. Why don't you make something of it? Build an application, build a dashboard, go for it, right? And oftentimes the challenge is much deeper than that. It's no, this data is garbage, right? We need to clean this up first, and then maybe we can talk. But governments, nonprofits don't typically know what non-garbage data looks like or how much time and money it really takes to get it into good shape, right? Private industry spends millions of dollars on this stuff. So how can we, as folks who are in more of the sort of social space, utilize expertise in a strategic way to make that possible? And so we just sort of ended the pilot of this project with Doherty. We were really excited because it served as a good professional development opportunity, right? Things that are published on GitHub that are open source that folks can refer to sort of as a resume builder, as well as building some really good work. So we're excited to see where it goes. But it's a good tale of garbage data needs data engineering that oftentimes governments and nonprofits can't afford on their own. So how can we continue to matchmake?
So, you kind of took mine, but what I can do is
other parts of it. We can talk about vacancy.
well, okay. I mean, one I could give just to give a little credit to some of the images of this. Avi Navani, one of our former members, and honestly, for a little while, he was running CFA for a bit. But he actually spent a lot of time talking with the city to actually get this project online and stressing into the importance of open data. Just give that a little air, and I'll move on to something that maybe not as successful. Maybe an example of what not to do. So our previous project, the Record STL, we got the software running, we got it in front of people. It seems that not too many people knew it existed. And even though we had, police officers were supposed to, tell people, give them on their ticket where to go to get the information to go to what court, it seems, between the lack of information and just lack of interest from the Missouri courts, it's sort of gonna die. What's happening is that it's going to, the Missouri Supreme Court has shifted to another piece of software. You might know it. It's by Regis. It's called Missouri Courts, also known as CaseNet. You may have used it, and it's what I think the entire state is shifting to, and that's that. The only hope of doing is re-implementing it on top of that. So that's a possibility.
Would you say that among the challenges of public data projects like this, have you found in some of these cases that getting the people who own this data to get on board with the idea that it should circulate more freely is one of the problems?
Yes.
You want to speak to that, Nehemiah? So,
this might be something you might have more interest in, more experience with. So when you ask a community or an organization to publicize its data, it's actually really revealing. It's actually really, it's asking someone to be vulnerable. And when we have bosses these days going through vulnerability training or vulnerability-based trust or exercise just to get them to build a better culture in their company, there's some value to vulnerability, but not everybody knows it. So when a government, I think the last thing Ivan and I told me is one of the things we've been doing wrong is going around talking about open data. Basically, we're telling people to open their checkbook instead of first showing them mint.com. And Mint or Intuit, I'm trying to think of another checkbook management software that you guys might use on your phones. It has value, but first you gotta trust, somebody like Intuit with your data, with your checking data. So cart before horse, perhaps. Right now, I think we've got it in the right direction, and the flip side of this though is now something I think the line item on, I want to say Kirkwood, or maybe it was Chesterfield's budget line, because they have to, and people started paying attention to it, was some $1,000 on P90s or P90s, yeah. This is a personal defense pistol. It's you maybe have seen it in movies. It's the one that goes instead of the rest of the normal sounding guns. It's a machine pistol. And it made it into the news a couple of times because that's a lot of money to spend on a personal defense device. That's the kind of vulnerability we're talking about. It makes most people itch. It makes most people uncomfortable. I'm not talking about the people in the public. I'm talking about the people that have to go and hand this data off to the public, and all of a sudden you got a spotlight on them. So it makes people uncomfortable to have to trust the public with their data. That's why you get politicians who, some of their staffers would tell you their primary job is just to keep them out of the news.
Yeah, it's a difficult issue, right? Because I think on the one hand, you do have politicians and government entities that are hesitant to share data because they think it may get them in trouble. And obviously that's bullshit, right? And obviously, right, if they have a public responsibility to share this information, they should do so in a way that isn't scanned PDFs. But I think that government in general is getting a little bit wise to the fact that one, if they share cleaner data more publicly on a more regular basis, the folks who benefit most are themselves, right? So like, there's this like, this sort of myth, right, that if you open data, you're gonna get a lot of like, neighborhood advocate grandmothers like going and pulling, trash pickup information and using that to improve their neighborhood. And that does happen, and I want that to happen more. But the folks who are typically using open data portals, right, that cities or counties or others are publishing are their own employees. Because it's easier to find that information there in a clean and accessible way than it is on some messy intranet. So I think it's changing. Just as local examples, we work very closely with both the city and the county, and both are moving toward, the county's already adopted one, the city will soon, open data policies, right, that can work across departments that say, hey, this is a value for us as a government. You should be publishing as much as possible in machine readable formats, and with documented metadata, et cetera, both as a public good and because it benefits us as a government entity. So those are the promising things. On the flip side, you also have data in public data in a government space, or in sort of a public sector space, really still being used in a high stakes, heavily punitive way. And the best example here is with school districts. So if I'm the Ferguson-Florissant School District, how do I view data, right? So data is used in standardized tests, which everybody hates, right? They're used to sort of like give these like really rigid scores to how well my school district is doing compared to my neighbors. And it just ends up being this burden, this compliance, that whenever anyone invokes data usage in a school environment, people get really afraid because people do get fired because of it, right? And so instead of asking a question of like, hey, what information do you need to do your job more effectively day over day, and sort of building it out from there, building a culture of using data for continuous quality improvement, it's almost always used for compliance and always used for sort of punishment, right? For accountability with like a capital A that makes everybody scared. And so one of the things that we do as the Regional Data Alliance is we try to work with folks as a capacity builder and not a watchdog, because we understand that the core of a lot of folks not sharing information is just no time and a real fear of what's going to happen. And so how do we frame this problem as one that is something that how can we use data to make our work more human? And I mean that very sincerely, right? Because a lot of folks don't use information in a way that, or use technology in a way that eliminates inefficiency or eliminates a lot of the guesswork that goes into providing educational services or government services. So people waste a lot of time on bureaucracy that data tools could solve. And our message needs to be, if you do that, right, and if you design this effectively, you will know more about how to do your work on a day-to-day basis in a more effective way, and you'll have more time to actually work with your constituents on solving problems. And that tends to get people's ears to perk up.
In terms of data sharing, I feel like from the Regis perspective, is a little different than like being in the public space, because we have like MOUs in place with, our board is composed of St. Louis City and St. Louis County Police Department members. So there's less of sharing with the public, but even from our perspective, when we want to do a project with like using Amazon for cloud storage, right? There's just a lot of trust issues, and suddenly, we have to really ask permission from our different agencies, like, hey, can we put your data?
Excellent. So another aspect of part of the undertaking for everybody who works with data, building tools and deploying algorithms, how do you keep in mind the potential unintended consequences? How do you make sure your tools and your algorithms are gonna not be evil? I would imagine that in this space that is at least as important as it is in the data space at large. I'd love to hear some comment on how you have approached that in projects you've encountered.
So this wasn't my project, but my answer to this question I've been asked before is to have the right people part of, the right people coming up with the algorithm, right? So, and the example, once again, my answer is open source, but hold on a sec. So my example comes from someone from, I think was Michigan Police Department. This was, I think, 2 summits ago, 2016, I think. The person left the police department because they were going to implement a mass data surveillance program by their police department, and this dude wanted no parts of that. To say he was black, and there's a history of black people being surveilled and that turning out not good for them. So he stepped away from the project and went to another city, and when he's now he's like making a presentation on the negative consequences of having a mass data surveillance project on stage at the last at the last Code for America summit, explaining that it wasn't just the massive amounts of data, but poor context around the data. See, you're going to draw the wrong conclusion if you're asking the wrong question, and that's. I'm gonna have to quote AOC on this, right? She says this is automated assumptions. Well, if your assumption is in poor faith, then you're gonna come up with the wrong conclusion, and this is a massive inference engine. That's what data science typically is science is drawing conclusions from, discovering patterns in nature and the causes of those patterns, right? But some people forget to actually look at the causes of those patterns and make sure they've actually discovered the actual cause of those patterns. They're just, oh look, correlation. And we gotta scream out, it's not causation.
So I'll give another recommendation, a book, Automating Inequality, which some of you may have heard of before, dives into this subject in great detail, much more than we'll be able to get in today. But I think there's a danger in, so look, the message is across, right? Like all that governments, nonprofits, healthcare systems seem to talk about now is data and data sharing. In a lot of ways, it's really promising because what they're saying is we want to be more accountable, we want to be more effective, right? We want to provide more strategic, care and services to people in our community. And on the other hand, we aren't asking these deep questions that don't be evil, right? Like folks like Google continue to step into about what if this data gets out and is monetized or otherwise used in ways that harm, especially people of color or otherwise vulnerable populations, and those are real challenges. So one of the things we're trying to do in our work in that space is put questions of privacy, security, and consent front and center, and try to build the protections of individuals sort of into the DNA of how these data systems are developed. And so we're doing a lot of work right now with United Way 211, BJC Healthcare. I'm building a more interconnected data system that helps hospitals and healthcare systems share patient or client data with social services and also social services among each other. So if you want to talk about trying to get all of these legacy data systems to play nicely with each other, please wish us luck. But there's a real harm here, right? So right now, if someone goes to a drug rehab center, which I wish there were many more of them, right, in our community to get access to treatment, and then cleans up and 6 months later goes into a job training center and accesses a job in that way, right now the job training center would have no idea, right, that someone accessed a substance abuse treatment center. If we connect these data systems, they could, right? And we need to be incredibly cognizant of how do we really put the ownership and the rights of this data in the hands of the person who it is supposed to benefit, right? Rather than what can happen, which is that hospital systems or social service systems say, look, it's getting too complicated, right? It's too hard to have people like consent and reconsent, have consent expire, right? Have an ability for them to access their own information and revoke consent if necessary. But from an ethical standpoint, from a standpoint of racial equity and really trying to make sure that we do no harm, that this work has benefit, it's essential that we build that into the front end. Because once the cat is out of the bag, it's going to be really hard to sort of mitigate those challenges on the back end.
So in terms of don't be evil, misuse of law enforcement data is like a really big deal and you go to jail. So we do a lot of end user training as well as at Regis, we have yearly recertifications in our CGIS, which is like the federal level of criminal justice security awareness stuff. In terms of how we ensure that our systems are not misused, it's huge on acceptable use agreements and auditing. So we have, like, we log every request and every response, not just for acceptable use stuff, but also in case there's a court case. And, you know, an officer says, well, I saw on this screen, Regis said blah, you know, then Regis is able to say, well, here's what we sent them. But I think in terms of setting up those acceptable use agreements, we have to work with our users, but like a good example of setting up acceptable use policies came when St. Louis County was doing a new license plate recognition system. So like the pole mounted cameras, you drive by and there's software on there that recognizes it's a license plate, reads whatever the plate is, then you check Regis and it says, is this plate, you know, wanted, stolen, missing, stuff like that. When they put that in place, St. Louis County did a great job of defining acceptable use for officers and crime analysts, and then they took their policy to the local ACLU and said, what do you guys think? And then got feedback in that way. So it's making sure there's a lot of sets of eyes on there. So similarly, Regis is doing a facial recognition pilot, and we're gonna follow a similar process. Like, we have sent people to the FBI CGIS training, and we've, in terms of facial recognition stuff, and we are like working with our experts in policy because it's such a hot issue right now of acceptable use for law enforcement purposes. So I think doing your homework, and then you were also saying knowing what your algorithms are doing. We had a funny example the other day for our search tool. We were looking at some other technologies. We saw that another tool is really good at personalization, and our developer stopped and said, we do not want personalized search results. Like if you work in a particular district or tend to arrest particular, you know, based on people you've arrested in the past, we do not want your search results affected at a personal level, you know? And so it's like stopping and thinking like, yeah, that's a cool feature, absolutely inappropriate for what we're trying to do. So being aware of the tools you're using is important.
Again, very, very well said by the panel. From a consulting perspective, you know, we solve problems based on what the client has, and then we pass everything off to them, and they become the owner of the product that we develop. And I'm really glad, Elizabeth, that you said that there's all these processes in place, checks and balances, because we've developed facial recognition software before, custom software, and we've handed off to an organization, and then once you give it to them, you don't know what happens. Right? And then you do a good job of trying to train them, making sure that they have policies in place, making sure they understand how it actually works, the positives, the negatives. But without regulation, I think it's going to be really difficult to keep things out of people's hands. I see some of the things that are happening in Europe, GDPR, which is I think a really, really, really good initiative. I mean, I know California has started to establish laws that are very similar and strict that give people the right to know what data is being collected about them, and they have the right to control it to a degree. And I think that's kind of where we need to start, continue to move in that direction.
Yeah. Does anybody else out here have any questions? Throw it open to the floor.
I have a question. So Dave Castanero from Prepared AI. I would like to know what your thoughts are on if there's an entrepreneur or a private company that is interested in earning the business, helping the public sector. I know there's a lot of roadblocks to that. It seems kind of daunting. What would you say? Like, are there certifications that you need to get? Are there conferences that you need to go to? Do you have to just wait for an RFP to fall from the sky? You know, I know a lot of these public organizations, they are understaffed and people are wearing a lot of hats and they don't have time to, you know, look and keep up with, oh, these are the greatest things that I could like save money on and implement and innovate. But if, you know, there's that mismatch between the people who are doing all that and have the new technologies and want to get them in their hands. What thoughts do you have on connecting those dots?
Yeah, it's a big challenge, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head. These entities are understaffed, right? Look, put yourself in the seat of the city of St. Louis. Losing population for a while, trying to figure out like general, you know, how the budget fits together, address crime, address corruption, et cetera, et cetera. And you go into them and you say like, hey, you really need to re-engineer your data so you can get, you know, smarter analysis out of it. It just doesn't rise to the surface. So I think part of it is being able to work closely with, right, these public entities or these sort of like big umbrellas, right? Like working with these like smaller nonprofits, I feel like sometimes is maybe the juice isn't worth the squeeze, right? Because they're part of larger networks, they're really sort of small and kind of stuck within their own context, and they're not going to be able to afford the sort of stuff that's really going to be transformative system-wide. But if you're working with the city, right, or working with the county or whatever, trying to be prepared to really understand what their challenges are and help them make the case to get funding allocated to put out the RFP, and then understanding that, right, the rules are that you may or may not get that. It's a rare company that is able to do that, but that's really what the sector needs right now. They need folks with expertise that are willing to spend a little bit of extra time helping folks on the inside, yeah, make the case for budget allocation, make the case that this is going to be transformative, maybe helping fund or helping find funding for pilot projects that can really show decision makers that this stuff matters. But without that, there's a gulf between what governments and nonprofits understand or are able to do right now and the things that are being done by companies like yours, right, or the private sector.
So there was, there's two, you said conferences, there's two actual sort of hackathons that I might suggest you might get contact with. There's Code for a Cause, some of you may have heard of it, and then more broadly and more commonly, Global Hack, because
Code with the Cause is a global hack program.
and I was like,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, cool.
exactly. So one came from the other, right? Otherwise, yeah, as far as the juice being worth the squeeze, that's exactly where Code for a Cause kind of comes in. Other than that, so I used to work for a massive department contractor, DoD contractor known as Booz Allen in Hamilton, former employer of Edward Snowden, and they told me that they had 3 types of billing situations, and this might be more common than I haven't done this much. So aside from actual billable, there's also marketing, and then there's training. So like marketing billable is more like investment stuff, so they get investment dollars to sort of train their new developers or benched people. He said benched, that refers, I used to think it was beached, like a whale. But either you're on the bench, you're on the beach, you're not working on billable hours, so we allocate you to do something that might yield fruit, potential.
So I look at a lot of vendors for my role, and I always get excited when they have a government page of examples of how they can help government. My other piece of advice is be inexpensive, but that's and also being flexible. We'll get you started but kind of giving options based on that limited budget, or just core functionality of here's how you could get started. Because like what my team has had a lot of success with is buying small prototypes or proof of concept things that we can build out ourselves, but like making just the budget option of your tool that in-house developers could work on or expand on.
Like from the aspect of class overfitting, how each one of you guys' organizations actually deals with that, because like, of course, a lot of like the trade-off between accuracy and precision is actually like going to be a business decision, and so if that business decision actually puts inadvertently or not people who are historically disenfranchised in a bad situation, how do you guys actually handle that? I mean, what's like the optimal what is you guys' optimal way for getting that best F1 score?
Can you state that one more time? Just want to make sure I understood.
Certainly, I was actually talking about class overfitting, because certainly you'll see situations like where you'll type in like good hair, and like you'll see pictures of white individuals, and like that is of course a historic bias, especially within Western cultures, against people with like curly or darker hair. And so that is an example of class overfitting, because the data samples that they've been given are mostly white people with straight hair. And so basically like the word to vec encoding actually then learns that straight white like equals good, black dark equals bad. So what's being done for class overfitting in you guys' individual organizations?
So our tools are either like exact search or name sound alike search. There's like kind of two avenues of our tools. We're either retrieving information based on a license plate or a name, and you can decide whether you want a name that sounds like whatever you're searching. Then the other class are these investigative tools. We have this total approach that it's not best in one. We give the detective 100 possible leads, and then we leave it to the detective to be doing the footwork of actually making their own investigation out of that. And we're not at a point where we're training our own models, and so we are assessing the models that we're using to, like in the facial recognition example, so we're using Amazon Web Services and reading all of the hype around that, or the assessments of that tool. And I think we're being aware of kind of the potential for misuse or bias in the algorithms. So maybe it sounds like we're not doing anything, but we're making sure that we're communicating to the user that this is by no means proof. This is something that the rest of the legal process needs to be activated on, or you need to be doing your own work. So it's kind of the attitude with which we present our results.
I forgot after you rephrased the question, but I think my answer was similar to yours in that we're basically, though we haven't implemented any actual data, something that could be called data science, my recommendation would be transparency in the model, or the modeling or the algorithms, I would say. Because that, one of the reasons, if you look, another example is like YouTube. If you see a lot of the trouble YouTube has been getting into is that the people creating the content are like completely powerless in the face of the algorithm that people, that the recommendation algorithm. Frankly, so Netflix has this problem, but people aren't quite as loud about it until your show gets canceled and you have no idea why. But like in the case of the YouTubers, they're getting demonetized, and there's just no transparency into that, and it's really pissing all of them off, all of them. So that transparency has so much value. And so including it, just being able to avoid the problem of like you say, should there be a class overfit, the person would be able to detect the problem and then possibly either retrain the model or at the very least we could calculate against the bias, right? But at least we would know it's there if there's transparency in your algorithm.
I guess real quickly, I'll say with a lot of the local governments and nonprofits we work with, I wish they could say they're like putting deep thought into the algorithms they use. But really, you would talk to a lot of folks about algorithms and they'd be like, what are you talking about, right? Like the mayor's office doesn't have anyone who does data analysis, right, for the city as a whole. United Way is only now thinking about how to leverage metrics and try to connect some information about organizations. And so we're really far behind. And, right, we have an opportunity to learn from the missteps of our, brothers and sisters in the private sector, right, who've been wrestling with this for a long time and have already fallen into, some of these traps, right, of not understanding what algorithms without context of the social environment can do and who they can harm if we're not careful. So I'm hoping we have more bandwidth over the coming years, but I think that the answer for a lot of local entities is how do we build that into the design?
I think that was a great question, and I believe that the person that trained that type of model, they used the wrong data, right? Because they thought something is beautiful, it doesn't necessarily mean somebody else thinks that's beautiful. And we've encountered situations where we've developed, we've used Amazon recognition for facial software, and sometimes it doesn't do a really good job. People with various ethnicities and colors, false positives occur. You have to explain that to the client. So that's where we went back. We developed custom software to hopefully get rid of some of those inaccurate classifications. But the problem is it doesn't run as fast. Right? But still, it depends on what your end use case is. So.
Yeah, I just thought of one more thing. So on the Amazon recognition topic, one thing that we did on purpose was hide the percent accuracy that face matches come back with so that you're not biasing the user and saying, because if you see something that says it's a 78% likelihood that this is your probe image, it's gonna bias your result. But if you just, I guess to kind of take away that anchoring, we're not showing those likelihoods on our results screens.
I have one more example. Oh, sorry.
Follow up?
Yeah, I just had a really quick, underline, but, one of the, biggest things is to please audit your models, because, certainly we've all heard of, that very famous, I hope we have, that famous example of a convolutional neural net that was classifying dogs versus wolves. And, when they were wondering why their accuracy was actually not what they hoped it would be, they started unpacking the layers that the model was actually training on. It was actually not training on the bridge of the nose or the width of the eyes. It was training on the snow in the background. And so that's how they were classifying their wolves versus dogs. And now it's like, okay, well, whose wolf or dog are you? Auditing, your models is super important because, you can't have the black box that we all just kind of throw up our hands and say, hey, the rise of the machines, I'm at it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
you.
All right, one final question. Thinking ahead to the next 20 years, what's the thing that you are most excited about in the prospects for data science in the public interest, or what are you the most scared about? Who wants to go first?
I would like to see some of the fragmentation go away, and in terms of law enforcement tech, your average police officer has way more power on their phone and just ease of use on their personal phone, and then they get to work and then they have to use these systems, and the systems don't talk to each other, and it's really a struggle. And so I would love to see more one-stop shop or more just integration between systems to make it easier for people to get their jobs done.
So adding to that, I am encouraged by folks that we've been talking to in understanding like, oh yeah, we don't need to make these decisions, these data decisions by purchasing a software or not purchasing a software, and let's ask more critical questions of those vendors in terms of who owns the data and is it interoperable, and are you gonna charge us an arm and a leg every time you wanna do a data transfer? So people are getting smarter about that. And so I'm encouraged and hopeful, right, that these systems can be more interoperable and thus more collectively powerful. And I'm afraid, right, that in the public interest, in the public good, we will always just be playing second fiddle to technological innovations that y'all have been playing with like 5 or 10 years ago. And so how do we get that better on balance? And really prioritize using data for public good in a way that it can help be the leading edge, right, rather than just get the leftovers.
So I am afraid of the commodification of said advances in technology. These are the breaks my blood when cold. Think of some of the dangerous things that individuals can do. So there's value in decentralization, but then, you know, there's a guy out there publishing designs to firing pins for guns. So like, yeah, 3D printed guns. We're getting that far when it comes to AI and data science, so.
I'm personally super excited about autonomous driving. I think that's the coolest thing. So prior to moving here to St. Louis 2 years ago, I lived in Phoenix, Arizona for a while. Absolutely beautiful place. I got to witness autonomous driving with Waymo. I got to drive in those cars. Governor Doug Ducey opened up legislations to allow companies to come in and actually test in the area that I used to live in. So it was really cool to just like walk into a Waymo vehicle, take a ride for free, and then have somebody just kind of observe and watch the vehicle do its thing. It is super easy in a place that has everything is brand new, all the roads in view. You have 330 days without a cloud in the sky. It rains 4 times a year. The population growth of 120,000 people per year. So it's super easy there. I'm interested to see how it will do in places where the roads are something like we drive on, that potholes, something when it's raining, you cannot see the lines on the street. So I hope that we can solve that one day. I think it's going to be super challenging, but I'm excited about it as well.
Autonomous driving is a great example of a future development in which there's plenty of room to be excited and scared both at once.